Ever notice how in crime shows they can hack a suspect's laptop like that? 2 clicks, and they've got every file, every deleted message.
Yeah.
It's almost like magic,
Yeah,
right?
like it's nothing.
But what we're talking about today hits a little closer to home than catching criminals. We're diving into the ethics of digital monitoring in relationships.
And we're not talking about just like glancing at your partner's Instagram feed while they're out of the room.
Mhm.
This is about spyware, secretly installed software that tracks everything, messages, location,
hmm
everything. And the person has no clue.
We're taking a deep dive into this using an outline for a podcast, actually, called Privacy versus Trust: The Ethics of Monitoring Your Partner's Digital Activity. I mean, right off the bat, you might think, why even go there? But relationships can be tough, right?
Absolutely.
So while you might say you'd never consider something like this, hear us out, because
Yeah, it is easy in this day and age, with how connected we are all the time, to let those anxieties and insecurities kind of creep into a relationship.
especially, like, what if you've been through infidelity in the past? That desire to protect yourself from getting hurt again, it's got to be strong.
And it's completely understandable. Although those anxieties and past hurts can be big factors, the outline actually points out that choosing to use spyware on a partner usually isn't some thought-out plan to control them. It's actually rooted in a much deeper need to just feel secure in the relationship.
That does make a lot of sense when you put it that way, but even if someone's coming from a place of insecurity, isn't putting spyware on their phone like saying, I already think you're lying.
Exactly. That's the big problem here.
Huh.
The podcast actually quotes a therapist who says that trust is the absolute core of any relationship, and when you bring surveillance into that, it's basically saying, I'm assuming you're lying already. That destroys the whole foundation of trust.
So even if you don't find anything on their phone, the damage is done just by looking, by being suspicious.
Most likely, yes. When you introduce that kind of suspicion, it just creates this awful dynamic. The person being monitored feels like they're constantly under a microscope, and the person doing the monitoring, they often end up feeling more anxious, more suspicious. It can really spiral.
That's awful. And this isn't all hypothetical. This podcast outline shares some real stories about people who've gone through this. One of them, let's call them Individual A, said that installing spyware on their partner's phone didn't calm their anxiety. It actually made it worse. They were worried about what they might find and also felt guilty that they were even looking in the first place.
It's like individual A's story shows how trying to grab onto control in one way can actually make you feel way less in control emotionally, which just adds to the problems you already had.
And then there's the flip side. Another person from the podcast, Individual B, found out their partner had been monitoring their phone. They said it absolutely shattered their relationship because it felt like such a huge violation of trust.
Yeah, talk about heartbreaking. And it shows how this isn't some simple thing with a right or wrong answer like should I use spyware or not. It's so much more than that.
It's easy to hear those stories, though, and just think, well, of course that's awful. But I think what's important here, what this outline does well, is get us away from pointing fingers and more towards really getting these ethical issues.
Exactly. It's easy to get stuck in that should I or shouldn't I about the spyware itself, but it's obvious that's just not enough. The outline made a really good point about consent being a huge deal in any situation like this.
And consent means more than just, hey, is it cool if I put this tracking app on your phone? Even asking that can do damage to a relationship.
No question. When you ask that, it puts all the pressure on the other person to prove they're trustworthy, instead of like dealing with the reasons there's no trust to begin with. It just puts them on the defensive.
It sounds like focusing on building that trust in the relationship is way healthier than going all digital detective.
For sure. And it takes us back to what that therapist said about trust being the foundation. That open communication, facing those insecurities head on, even going to therapy together, those are hard, but they're going to be more effective than going the spyware route.
It's got to be tough to have those hard conversations, be that vulnerable with each other. But we've heard how spyware just makes things worse over time.
100%. When you try to force trust using something like spyware, it's like trying to put out a fire with gasoline. You might think it's a quick fix, but you're making the whole thing way worse. And that's why this deep dive is so key here. We're not trying to tell anyone what to think or do in their own relationships. It's about giving you the info to think for yourselves, to look at what's going on in your own relationships.
What I'm taking from this is, if you're even thinking about spyware, that should be a red flag. It's not even about what your partner is doing. It's saying something's missing in the relationship itself.
Totally agree. This isn't about catching your partner doing something wrong. It's about how you build a good relationship, one that's built on respect and trust, and that takes effort and honesty from both people, even when it's hard.
Which is definitely tougher than clicking download on some app, but putting in that work to build that trust is the only way to have a relationship that's actually good and healthy.
That's a really good point.
Hmm.
Instead of asking yourself, is it okay to monitor what my partner's doing online? Maybe a better question is,
What needs to be there in my relationship in me so I don't even have to think about this stuff? That changes things, puts the focus in the right place.
for sure, it's not about trying to catch them doing something wrong. It's about having the kind of relationship where that thought doesn't even come up.
That is so true. The outline actually calls this digital intimacy, which I think is interesting.
Right. Like, think about it. Real closeness,
Hmm.
the emotional kind, and in our digital lives, that only works if there's trust. And if the trust is built on spying, that's not trust. That's control disguised as something else.
Yeah, and who wants to live like that? Constantly looking over your shoulder, wondering about every text, every email. That sounds exhausting.
Totally. It just misses the whole point of being in a relationship. Relationships are about connecting, being open with each other, sharing your life without being scared of what they'll think.
And no app can give you that.
Yeah.
Well, I think we've given everyone a lot to think about today, this whole thing about digital monitoring.
It's complicated, that's for sure. Yeah. But like we've been saying, talking openly, really working on trust, even getting help from a therapist, those are the things that can help build a relationship that's actually healthy.
So true. And on that note, we'll let you get back to your day. Until next time, remember, real intimacy starts with trust.